In April 1977, one of the most important disability rights protests took place in the US. It was known as the 504 sit-ins, where disability rights activists across the US and especially in San Francisco occupied government federal buildings to demand greater accessibility and accommodations for disabled people. But why is it important to talk about that moment in history in this current moment in time? Well, currently in the US, disabled rights may be under attack, but to understand what's at stake, we need to go back a little bit. The 1977 protests were based around a bit of legislation known as Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. This bit of legislation would require the federal government to enforce affirmative action in regards to disabled people in the workplace, but also ensure that there is accessibility and accommodations in organisations that get federal funding. This would include hospitals, schools, post offices, train stations, and many more. But the issue at the time was that Section 504 wasn't actually being enforced and the regulations weren't getting published. This meant that it was impossible to check the regulations and actually enforce the law. So even though American disabled people had this bit of legislation, they weren't actually seeing the benefits from it. Without the regulations actually being published, accessibility wasn't really taking place. And without accessibility, disabled people are blocked from participating in society. Organisations who would have to comply with the regulations of Section 504 didn't really want to. They didn't want to spend the money to provide better accommodations and accessibility. And it's said that some of these organisations would lobby with politicians to try and weaken the regulations. From 1972 all the way up until the sit-ins, presidents at the time like Nixon and Ford would continuously delay and stall 504 being affirmed. By 1977, disabled people were fed up of waiting. They demanded that the Health, Education and Welfare Secretary, which at the time was Joseph A. Califano, sign the regulations of Section 504 or resign. He did neither. This led to the protest that we know as the 504 sit-ins. On April 5, 1977, 10 protests happened across the US outside of health, education and welfare offices. They happened in these places, but one place lasted longer than the others. San Francisco. Most protests ended after a few days, but the San Francisco sit-ins lasted for 26 days. Disabled people of all different life experiences occupied 50 UN Plaza in San Francisco. Key figures included Judy Heumann, Kitty Cohn, Brad Lomax, Dennis Billups, and many, many more. To me, the most beautiful thing about these protests were the display of collaborative care. Makeshift fridges were made to keep food and medication cold. People with limited mobility were assisted to stop them from getting bed sores. And when telephone lines were cut, it was deaf people and other ASL users that were integral to keeping communication with people on the outside. Other groups also supported the sit-ins, and these groups included Glide Memorial Church, Brick Hut Lesbian Cooperative, the International Association of Machinists, the Salvation Army, and the Black Panther Party, which it must be stated that Brad Lomax was essential in forging this connection. Eventually, a delegation of protesters of the sit-ins travelled to DC, but even during the travel to DC, they were still dealing with barriers. Most transport was not accessible for wheelchair users, so they had the genius idea of hiring a box truck which was able to transport multiple wheelchair users at the same time on a budget. But of course, no surprises here. The president at the time, by this point that would have been Jimmy Carter, wasn't interested in speaking with the protesters, nor was the Secretary of Health, Education and Welfare. They actively avoided the protesters. But by that point, there was so much media coverage on the 504 sit-ins that there was added pressure for the establishment to sign in the regulations. Eventually, Joseph A. Califano signed the regulations of Section 504, and with this victory, the remaining protesters left 50 UN Plaza. I love reading about this part of disabled history, but it's not just history, it's happening right now in 2025 because Section 504 is currently at risk. In September 2024, 17 states filed a lawsuit against the US Department of Health and Human Services. A large part of this lawsuit pertains to gender dysphoria in regards to Section 504, but also there have been talks about ruling Section 504 as unconstitutional in general. I should add though that upon recording this video, articles have come out stating that this lawsuit has been paused, so I guess we'll have to see what happens next. I've written in the description some of my favourite US-based creators that have been keeping me in the know about the current situation with Section 504. You should definitely follow them. Of course, there are many more, and you can tag them below as well. Disabled people are some of the most creative people on the planet, as we constantly find creative ways to live, to survive in the face of inaccessibility and people that don't believe we should exist. And the fight to protect our existence continues.